All right, we're back. We're going to talk a little bit about federalism specifically. And as you can see, federalism is a system of government in which a written constitution divides the power of government on a territorial basis. Now, understand this is that written constitution is highlighted here because of the necessity to make sure that each level of government, whether it be national, state, or local government, has clearly defined roles, jobs, tasks. And that's where the Constitution really does a pretty good job. Although every single day the Supreme Court hears issues regarding whether it is a national power or a state power, or a state oversteps its bounds, or the national government oversteps its bounds. So, and then the last thing is it divides the powers of government on a territorial basis between a central or national government and several regional governments. And again, if you remember back when I talked about the idea of kind of bigger umbrellas, the national government essentially has a larger regional area that it kind of has the responsibility to oversee. States have a smaller area that they're responsible for, and then local governments have an even smaller area. So let's look at the powers of the national government, and I have these words highlighted here, and it's very important that you kind of begin to understand these because we'll be coming back to them over and over. But the national government is a government of delegated powers, and what that means is these powers are granted to it in the Constitution because they are in the Constitution. They specifically are given to the national government. So, for example, there are powers that are expressed, or really what that means is they are directly written in the Constitution. These are powers that, for example, in the legislative branch of Article 1 states in Section 8 that Congress has 27 specific powers. And we've heard them before: coining money, declaring war, things like that. Those are expressed, they're written. Now, there's also powers within the Constitution that are what are called implied powers. And what these are is, think about the term implied. If something is implied, it's kind of said but not really said. Or maybe that's the other way around. It's not really said, but the meaning is really, really clear. And so within the Constitution, the implied powers are not expressly stated like they are above, but they're suggested. And what we see here is in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, this is the last one, there's something called the Necessary and Proper Clause. Now, I didn't write it out here, but it's the Necessary and Proper Clause. And what that is an implied power that essentially says that Congress shall have the power to do whatever is necessary and proper to carry out its functions. So you might sit there and think, well, what is necessary and proper? And that's a good question because, as a parent, I can do whatever is necessary and proper in raising my children. However, that doesn't give me unlimited rights to be able to, beat them or run them over with the car or deny them food. Or that's not what necessary and proper is. Necessary and proper is the idea that, well, let's say, for example, Congress, the founders, the early writers of the Constitution didn't think of everything, so they kind of give, Congress in this case like a get out of jail free card. They can, if they deem that something was not expressly written in the Constitution but needs to be included, they can use the necessary and proper clause to kind of include it at a later date. And then lastly, we see the inherent powers. Now, inherent kind of means like born with, so like, inherent genetics, things like that. But inherent powers belong to the national government because it's the government of a sovereign state within a world community. And what I mean by that is think about the national government. We've already talked about this a little bit, but the national government has certain powers just because it's the national government. The national government has the power to regulate borders. The national government has the power to regulate trade with other countries. It would be illogical for Indiana to sign a peace deal with Iraq when the national government is clearly at odds with the government. Or we could say the same thing, Iraq and Afghanistan. I keep going back to them, but they're not really wars as we know them, because war usually denotes like between two states, and in this case it's a state, the United States, versus kind of an organization or a group of people, a belief. So it's a little bit different, but anyway, the national government has the powers to regulate borders, has the powers to regulate immigration. Arizona cannot regulate the borders of Arizona, although they've tried. So that's just something to kind of understand. So we have expressed, implied, and inherent. Okay, written, said but not really said, and naturally given to. Now, understand this though: there are powers in the Constitution that are denied to the national government. And if you look at the Bill of Rights, you'll see, like, for example, Congress has the power to levy duties on exports. Sorry, they cannot levy duties on exports. I'm misconstruing that. But certainly they cannot prohibit freedom of religion. You can't tell somebody what they can't believe. It's just they can't act on their beliefs if what they believe is kind of contrary to, community standards. Congress cannot prohibit freedom of speech, although they can restrict it. They cannot prohibit the freedom of the press, although they can restrict it. They cannot prohibit the freedom of people the right to peaceably assemble, although they can restrict it. And so understand that the national government cannot deny those powers. Let's go ahead and now, how about the states? What does the states have? Well, the 10th Amendment says this, is that those powers that the Constitution does not grant to the national government and does not at the same time deny to the states becomes a state power. And you'll look at that and you'll go, what does that mean? It just really means this, that the states have certain powers that are reserved to it. And what you need to understand is that the 10th Amendment is kind of very vague in the sense that it does have double negatives here. It does not grant to the national government and does not at the same time deny it to the states, meaning it doesn't give it to the national government, but it really doesn't say that the states can't have it. That's kind of maybe a way to think about it. Now, we have some different kind of powers here, but this more deals with which ones are specific to one level of government, the national or state, and which one maybe they share. So an exclusive power is a power that is exclusively the national government's alone. And as you can see, coining money or making treaties or laying duties or taxes on imports. But there's also what's called concurrent powers. And concurrent powers are where both the national government and the states possess those powers and exercise them kind of in tandem. Any of you that have a job, and when you get your paycheck, you immediately see how much the government takes out. And the national government takes out a piece, the state government takes out a piece, and the local government takes out a piece. So that is a power that is shared concurrently by all the levels of government. We also see, they can define crimes and set punishments and claim private property, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about eminent domain. But I think this chart kind of gives us, and disregard the 115 here, but this chart really kind of lays out what are some national powers, what are some state powers, and then what powers do they kind of share together. So we have a pretty good Venn diagram here. And then lastly, I just want to identify the supremacy clause. We've talked about it 2 or 3 times, but understand this: the Constitution states that the Constitution is supreme. Every act or law or treaty that Congress essentially signs off on has to follow the Constitution. All state constitutions must follow the will of the Congress, which ultimately then must follow the Constitution. State laws have to follow state constitutions, which have to follow congressional laws or national laws, which follows the Constitution. And then city or county charters or ordinances, they have to follow state statutes, which have to follow state constitutions. You get the idea. So understand this: every state has its own constitution. Every state has a constitution that is much more specific than the United States Constitution. The United States Constitution was vague for a reason, so that our country, as it grew, and as it grows, has the ability to kind of change and adapt and adapt our kind of underlying fundamentals. Well, state constitutions are much more specific. For example, in Indiana, recently Republicans have tried to create a state constitutional amendment that bans same-sex marriage. And the problem was ultimately it never passed because, one, the will of the people kind of persuaded the state lawmakers not to pursue it, but also there was just an issue as to, is denying someone the right to marry, does that violate their equal protection under the law? And if you remember way back, we've already talked about like the 14th Amendment, but we'll certainly come back to it again. So states can try to set up more specific rights or restricting those rights, but ultimately the national constitution will supersede that. So hopefully that's helped.